I went from being a suicidal, delusional, hypochondriacal, paralyzed human being to being one of the more joyful people I know.
One of the things I've been exploring really in depth, especially in the last month, is the intersection between a biblical injunction and a gospel injunction. So the biblical injunction is, do not use the Lord's name in vain. Now, people think that means don't swear, and that isn't what it means.
Right.
It isn't what it means. It might mean that in some peripheral sense, because it is a warning against the careless use of God's name. But what it really means is, do not claim moral virtue, especially of the highest sort, for acts that are clearly self-serving. Now, there's no more self-serving act than one that's narcissistic. And by definition, because narcissism is the core of self-serving. Okay, so a narcissistic act is one that elevates my moral virtue falsely. Okay, so now then imagine the worst extent of that sin is for me to claim that my narcissistic motivations are actually done in the name of what's highest. And that would be God in the case of the totalitarian religious zealot. And it would be compassion in the case of the modern left-leaning atheist who, has basically made the goddess of mercy his or her unconscious God. Okay, so now I can claim false moral virtue, and I can elevate my social status and my self-regard without commensurate effort, and I can circumvent all the problems you just described, which is actually contending with the depth of my genuine misalignment and sin. Okay, now that's echoed in the Gospels. Like, Christ goes after the Pharisees in particular as hypocrites. And so they're the religious types that you just described, the ones that parade their moral virtue. They're the same as the bloody modern protesters too. But the false butter won't melt in their mouth evangelical types and the zealots in the Islamic world, they're all of the same type. They take this unearned moral virtue, they're acolytes of God, and they use that. Christ accuses their praying in the marketplace, which is no different than protesting, to elevate their social status so that they have good reputation among men, which he also warns about, and so that they can occupy the highest seats in the synagogue. And so there's this terrible sin, and it's opposition to that sin that gets Christ crucified. Right? Because it's the Pharisees he really makes enemies of. And he says to them, they worship the dogma of men as if it's the commandments of God, and that they are the same people that would have killed the prophets whose words they purport to worship. Like, they're vicious criticisms being put forward by Christ. He makes terrible enemies out of the Pharisees. But what he is calling out is exactly what we see at Davos. It's exactly that. This presumption that mere ideological purity and the claim to serve a higher power, I'm saving the planet, is sufficient to pass for the genuine moral effort of hoisting your own goddamn cross, as it turns out, in a more fundamental sense, right? It's a substitute for true moral effort.
It's true, and it brings us back to the idea about sometimes solving the problem is the problem. One of the wonderful things about the Enlightenment is it gave us all these systems that marshal human flaws for the good of all. So you have capitalism, which is a wonderful economic system, and you have democratic republics, which elevate people to power ostensibly on merit and some kind of connection to the people, but they don't eliminate the fact that the love of money is the root of all evil and power corrupts. So what you now have is people who no longer have to confront the parasitical nature of their wealth, because they can say, oh, well, I created jobs, I created wealth, I spread the wealth, but they're still corrupted in soul because they fall in love with money, which is a form of idolatry, and it does eat people away. And you have people who are in power, whether through wealth or through election, who can say, well, it's not like Henry V thinking all this is a ceremony. I actually have been elevated by the people, or by election, or I created Amazon.com, or I did something like that. And yet that power is still corrupting. So as we solve the problems, we still haven't eliminated the fact that the human being is a broken system. It's a contradictory system, a system that actually is aiming, what it was Oscar Wilde, I think, who said we're all standing in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. And I think that idea that we forget that we're standing in the gutter, because now we can actually say, Tolstoy, found God, and he thought, oh my God, I'm a parasite. I'm living on the backs of the serfs. But now you don't have to say that anymore. And people, this is why I despise Ayn Rand, by the way. This is why I just can't, aside from the fact that she's a terrible writer, I just can't stand this elevation of power and wealth to a state of virtue. It's simply not. It is power and wealth, and sometimes it's deserved, and sometimes it's used correctly by people who have virtue, but it's not the virtue itself, and it can be incredibly destructive to the human soul.
Yeah, well, the reason that I've stayed as firmly as I've been able to in the psychological domain is because I don't believe that systemic alteration strikes to the core of the problem. I've been concerned, I would say my fundamental intellectual interest, it's not only intellectual, existential interest, is the issue of evil. And I'm not really that interested in systemic evil, partly because I'm much more interested in actual individual motivation. Because I wanted to know how I could be an Auschwitz prison guard. But more than that, I wanted to know how I could be an Auschwitz prison guard and enjoy it. And if you don't think that you are that person, you don't know much about people. Now, that doesn't mean that there are some people who would be tilted more in the direction of the temptations and pleasures that being an Auschwitz guard would provide, right? There's some people who are more temperamentally protected against that particular sinful route. It'd be very hard for someone who is hyper compassionate to make that particular error. They'd be much more likely to turn into a devouring mother, for example, and infantilize everyone. But I was still very curious about how you erect barriers in your own soul to the blandishments of those who would provide for you an avenue to that kind of sadistic misuse of power. And you might say, I'd never do that. And I'd say, no, the opportunity for you to do that just hasn't presented itself. And that might be because of your own inability, not your moral virtue. You've just never managed to elevate yourself to a place where you have power over anyone else. And that's not a virtue. That's that weak man that we were talking about at the beginning of the discussion. And that's also and this can segue us into the next part of this conversation maybe. That's actually also what got me interested in theological ideas, because I became convinced that the fundamental issues that beset us are psychological, but that the fundamental psychological issues are indistinguishable from the theological. And so, because I think the battle against evil, and I do believe in the reality of evil, the battle against evil is fundamentally fought in the soul. And so now you have had a long journey towards a relatively elaborate faith, and it's not the faith that you were born into.
Right.
And so, do you want to walk us through that a bit? And I'd like to know, what were the steps? How did this come about? I'd also like to know how it dovetailed with your fiction writing in particular, because I think of the theological as like metafiction,
Yeah, it created actual problems in how to write natural fiction. For a while, I wandered into fantasy writing because it was the only way I could express the new level of reality that I was seeing. But ultimately, I found that very unsatisfying because I feel that God is God of the real world. I feel he's not a fantasy God. He's not God of Candyland. He's God of this world. Since I was baptized at the age of 49, it's kind of a long story, so I don't want to go into it.
That's okay. Yeah. That's okay. We'll lay it out because I'm very curious about. I think it'd be helpful for the listeners.
Well, so. When I was in college, the first wave of the postmodernists were coming on, and we were starting to hear about relativism and the disjunction of language with meaning and all of these things. And I guess I was 19 years old, and I read Crime and Punishment. And
when was this? What year was that?
If 19, it would have been 73.
73. Okay, so now I'm situated in time. You read Crime and Punishment. Oh, that'll do the trick.
Yeah, exactly. And, here's this scene of a man who, Dostoevsky was writing before Nietzsche, but Dostoevsky, I believe, was an actual prophet, and he actually prophesied what Nietzsche was going to say. He saw those ideas coming. And so you have this scene in a novel where a man takes an axe, not just to the pawnbroker who is bedeviling him, but to her retarded sister, and kills in just a scene of incredible innocence and evil, kills a woman who can't think straight and just looking at him with this blank look. And I thought, there is no way this is not an evil act. And I think that's Dostoevsky's point. There is no construct that you can have. And this, to me, is the only leap of faith I ever took. The only leap of faith I ever took in my journey to Christianity was saying that there is something that is evil, and therefore something that is good or not evil, whether or not every single person in the world thinks so, and whether or not you can convince yourself it's not. It remains evil. And that means that our physical actions and our mind is linked to a level of meaning above the natural, which is what I mean when I say supernatural. I don't mean like magical things happening.
Do you mean transcendent?
Transcendent, yes. And it transcends the natural and the physical. And so for that to be true, first of all, that moment when that murder happens in that book inoculated me to the blandishments of postmodernity. So when I read, if you read the mad scene in Hamlet, Hamlet walks through all of the ideas in postmodernity. He says, well, I'm reading, what are you reading? I'm just reading words, as if the words were disjointed from meaning. He says, nothing's either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. That's relativism. And the only thing about that is Shakespeare, the great, showing to you that Hamlet is pretending to be mad. He knows that the things that he's saying are mad, but the professors who were coming into my university didn't know it. They actually thought what they were saying was sanity. And I think what Shakespeare was saying was they really did know, but they were saying it anyway because the logic was following that way. So that inoculated
for other darker motivations, right? Yeah. Because it allows for a complete abdication of responsibility and a descent into responsibilityless hedonism. That comes along with it. There's no way around that. That's why the Marquis de Sade is also a standard bearer of the Enlightenment rationalists.
And he played
and then Dostoevsky knew that. I mean, the thing that's so remarkable about Crime and Punishment, you pointed to one of the things, and it was certainly my investigations into what had happened in Nazi Germany and in worse places even, the horrors that were perpetrated. If you can read about those and you can imagine human beings doing that, and you don't regard that as evil, I don't want to be anywhere near you.
That should wake you up. Yeah.
Oh, God, if that doesn't wake you up. And I think this is so interesting that you had a very similar experience. I think Sam Harris had a very similar experience, by the way, too, because he's been obsessed by the issue of evil as well. Like, evil is something so palpable that if you face it, then you'll either become convinced of its reality or there is no hope for you.
That's right. And once you become
so that happened with Crime and Punishment for you, eh?
Well,
that's so interesting.
It did, but because of my milieu, because I was a secular Jew in coastal cities in the artistic world, I was a novelist.
Yeah.
I was dealing with sophisticated people. The idea of believing in God unironically, or even beyond the Jungian, well, you can't tell whether this is a delivered meaning or a real meaning. That idea was absolutely closed to me. I couldn't reach it. And so I spent many years struggling with the postmodernists in my novels. The themes of my novels are, how could you tell what was real? I'm writing thrillers, but they were thrillers about the nature of reality, the inability of theory to contain reality. And so I was struggling with that. And I was beginning to realize that you simply could not get to moral reality without some idea of an ultimate good, and that ultimate good had to be a personal good, because there is no good without choice, without consciousness, without morality. So I was beginning to understand.
Maybe without relationship, it's so interesting, because one of the things that happens in the Old Testament is this weird insistence that our fundamental relationship with reality must and should be covenantal. It's actually a relationship that's best construed. Well, and then you think, okay, let's think about that for a minute. Okay, so what's a human being? Well, a human being is a personality. Now, if a personality can function in the world, like a personality exists in relationship, that's like the definition of a personality. And so if it's our personality that enables us to survive, to exist, then in what possible manner is our relationship with the world not covenantal in the final analysis? Like, I can't see a way out of that. And so that means there's a personal element to it that's relationship-like. It's not like we stand as dead objects in relationship to a set of dead facts. That's not how it works.
You know, this is why, to me, if there's such a thing as the most profound moment in all of literature, it's Moses confronting the burning bush, because he's confronting what's a symbol of the creation and destruction of the world. Things are born and they die. They grow and they're consumed, but they never end. Yeah. And it says to him, I am. It says that this is a person speaking to him. Right. And the fact that is happening. Yes, and the fact that it's happening between a consciousness, Moses's, and this object, which is the universe, essentially in small, makes it impossible to know whether it's in that relationship that it becomes I am, which was kind of what Jung, I think, was talking about, the uncertainty of that. But it also sort of says, more in an Aquinas point of view, that if you accept this on faith, you will then contain it. It will then become part of what you see.
Well, there's more in the Moses story than that too, which is absolutely crucial, because up to that point, Moses is a escapee from Egypt. He's essentially a wanted criminal, and he's a shepherd. Now, he's doing all right as a shepherd, and he's made a good relationship with his father-in-law, and he's got a couple of wives. Like, he's got a normal life. But then he has that encounter with the ground of being, right, that beckons to him, and he pursues it deeply, and then the voice of being itself speaks to him. But then the next thing happens. That's when God charges him with the responsibility and the ability to stand up against tyranny and to oppose slavery, right? So now all of a sudden, because Moses has made that connection with being itself, he now becomes the person who can genuinely lead. And then he says to God, it's like, well, you're charging me with this, and this is revealed to me, but I don't even know how to speak. And God says, yeah, that's your problem, buddy. And that's so interesting because it's so interesting because so Moses is now delved deep into some interest that beckoned to him, and he's confronted the fundamental reality of being itself, and that's transformed him. And now he's left with the aftermath of that, which is he has to figure out how, as the flawed person he is, unable even really to speak, because Moses has some impediment in his ability to communicate, he still is charged with the moral obligation, like your superhero characters or like Philip Marlowe, like your heroes, to stand up against tyranny and to oppose slavery. And, it's an open question for all of us, especially if we're concerned with authoritarianism or licentious hedonism, for that matter. It's like, what is it that transforms us into the sort of person who has the moral fortitude to stand up against that? And it is something like the establishment of a relationship with the ground of being itself. If you have that burning inside you, nothing is more frightening than losing that relationship. Nothing.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it also gives you the idea that because you can communicate with it, you can become like unto it. You can move into that image of God within you that is your essential personality that we all know we've fallen short of.
Right.
What happened to me, and this is kind of interesting because it goes back to the Marquis de Sade, is I came to a point where the logic of God became unavoidable. But on almost the same moment, and maybe for similar reasons, though I think they were much more deeply personal and connected to my past, I had a crack up. I went nuts. And I found a psychiatrist who is recognized as one of the greats, and what I now consider to be a literal miracle. He cured me. I went from being a suicidal, delusional, hypochondriacal, paralyzed human being to being one of the more joyful people I know. It was insane. I mean, this transformation was entire and insane. I always
When was this? When was this?
I was about 28 when I cracked. And by the time I was 30, I was on the way out. I was on the way back. If you loved that, and I know you did, like and subscribe, and also subscribe to The Andrew Klavan Show wherever you get your podcasts.